While this channel will always focus primarily on ghosts and hauntings, every now and again I'd like to explore something a little different, especially when the folklore is too strange or, well, frightening to ignore. Scotland has no shortage of legendary creatures. The Highlands and Islands are rich with tales of water horses, second sight, fairy abductions, and witches who cursed crops and called down storms. Ghosts continue to haunt old battlegrounds and in ruined castles, and the country's deepest and darkest lochs are said to hide ancient, monstrous creatures beneath the surface. These stories are more than just legends and folklore. They are rooted in the land and the culture. But there's one creature you don't often hear associated with Scotland: werewolves. Vampires, witches, fairies, yes, but the idea of a man turning into a wolf feels like something from continental Europe, not the glens and coastlines of the north. Still, werewolf stories do exist in Scotland, if you know where to look. And to be honest, when I was a kid, werewolves unsettled me just as much as ghosts ever did. So given we've already covered vampires twice on this channel, it felt only fair to finally turn to the werewolf, Scotland's most elusive shapeshifter. You'll find traces in old newspaper reports tucked away in folklore collections and passed down through generations in local stories. We think we know the rules: full moons, silver bullets, men cursed to lose control and transform. But that's the werewolf as popular culture tells it. Scotland's stories don't follow that script. They rarely mention the word werewolf at all. What they describe instead is harder to pin down. People turning, creatures seen standing upright in the dark, something witnesses describe as not quite human and not quite animal either. We won't be talking about the wolver here. That story of a solitary wolf-headed creature who leaves fish on windowsills, which has become popular in recent years, especially online. Although there's debate around whether it was truly ever part of Shetland folklore, or if it was a much later invention. Either way, it doesn't fit the pattern of traditional werewolf stories. There's no violence, no transformation, no fear. There are many other stories that go deeper. In the 19th century, a remote pass on the Isle of Skye gained a particularly dark reputation. Road builders working through the night fled in terror after hearing what they described as unearthly shrieks in the hills. Travellers were thrown to the ground, often by something they couldn't see. Other witnesses said it took the form of a one-legged man, others a prowling beast that walked like a dog but wasn't. Locals called it the beast Loch, the beast of the pass. The attack stopped suddenly after the body of a man was found lying by the road, his wounds too strange to be attributed to the wildlife of Skye. The story was recorded in 1902, but it was long before that, one of the many Highland tales where something not quite human stalked the night. In this episode we're looking into the stranger corners of Scottish history, unexplained attacks by creatures that walked on two legs. The stories that aren't just about legend, but about something people believed they really saw. These are Scotland's werewolf stories. Our first account takes us back to the late 16th century, during the reign of James VI, a time when suspicion and superstition made good bedfellows, and the line between justice and revenge was often thin. It was also the age of witch trials, when women were burned for curses, storms and gossip, and the king himself took a personal interest in rooting out the devil's work. With so much focus on the supposed evils of the community, what happened out in the woods, sudden, brutal, and harder to explain, often went unchallenged, or was buried altogether. In the early months of 1573, a royal messenger was sent north through Perthshire. His name has been lost, or perhaps deliberately omitted, but he was said to be carrying sensitive correspondence related to land disputes in the region. Nothing unusual, nothing high profile, just one man on horseback with orders to ride from Stirling to a settlement near Dunkeld. He never arrived. What happened next wasn't written down in great detail, but the fragments we do have come from a combination of official records and local oral history, the kind that sticks around long after the facts fade. According to an entry in Calderwood's History of the Kirk, a royal courier was reported missing, presumed dead, somewhere along the woodland track east of Crieff. The search party found his horse first, grazing, riderless, with deep scratch marks down its flank. Then they found the messenger, or most of him. His body had been torn open, the torso stripped of flesh and parts, the arms twisted at unnatural angles. A trail of blood led off into the trees, but there was no sign of any other person, no weapon, and no clear prints on the ground. This was long before the term forensics had any meaning, but even to those used to violent death, the scene was disturbing. At first, the blame was placed on wolves, but there was a problem. Wolves were already rare in Scotland by the 1500s. They'd been hunted aggressively for decades, driven deep into the Highlands and out of populated areas. Local farmers insisted there hadn't been a sighting in years. And besides, there was something off about the way the man had been attacked. The wounds weren't like those left by a pack. They were focused, as if inflicted by a single creature. The kill hadn't been quick either. There were signs the man had tried to fight back, bruises on the knuckles, splintered branches nearby, even a broken knife blade found several feet from the body. But the strangest detail came from one of the men in the search party. He claimed he saw something just before they found the body. A figure, tall, hunched, and furred, moving through the trees on two legs. He described it as neither man nor beast, but something between, with shoulders too broad for a person and eyes that reflected the light, even in the shade of the forest. It was gone before anyone else could see it. The story made its way back to court, but with the Reformation still reshaping Scotland's religious landscape, it wasn't a good time to be speaking of monsters. The messenger's death was officially blamed on wild animals, and the case was closed. No arrests were made, no further investigation. But in the glens around Crieff, the story stuck. Locals started calling that stretch of road the Red Way, and for years after, travellers reported uneasy feelings there. A handful claimed to hear growling in the woods. One man, a shepherd, insisted he saw a figure crouched by the riverbank at dusk, covered in dark hair, its hand slick with something red. The sightings were rare, but they continued well into the next century, gradually fading into cautionary tales told around hearths. It is important to say here that this wasn't the era of romantic werewolves. Scotland had its share of supernatural beliefs, redcaps, fairies, selkies, but the idea of a man transforming into a beast wasn't deeply rooted in Highland or Lowland tradition. This account predates the Gothic novels and Victorian stage plays that would later shape the werewolf legend. But what's notable is the consistency in how it's described. A creature upright, violent, and vanishing without trace. Some folklorists believe these kind of stories reflect old fears, resurfacing in new forms, that the woods, though tamed by man, still held on to something ancient, something wild. Others argue that tales like the messenger killing may have been early attempts to explain murder or madness in remote areas. And then there's a simpler idea, that one wolf did survive, against the odds, roaming alone in a dying landscape. But if that's the case, it was a clever wolf, one that walked on two legs, left no tracks, and was never seen again. The Cairngorms have always been a different kind of wilderness. Not dramatic in the way the west coast is, no jagged, picturesque mountain tops, but harsher, less forgiving. In winter, the wind cuts across the granite slopes like a blade. Even in summer, the glens can feel empty. Wide stretches of moorland with no sign of life beyond the odd red deer, a circling bird, or a walker in the distance. And tucked into those hills, just south of Benmacdui, lies Glen Luibeg, a narrow ribbon of land bordered between thick pine woods and stony slopes. Today it's a route for hikers and hill walkers, but in the 18th century it was something else entirely, and locals avoided the place. There was no one event that turned Glen Luibeg into a place of unease, no massacre, no cursed laird, no lost chapel, but stories began to build around it, the kind of stories that don't start with fact, but with observation and with unease, with the sense that someone or something was there when you were meant to be alone. The most prominent tale comes from a shepherd whose family worked the hills south of Braemar. He told his story late in life to a visiting minister who recorded what he could remember. The man didn't claim to see a werewolf, not in so many words, but he described a creature that walked like a man, ran like a dog, and never left tracks. It started with a sound, not howling, but something lower, almost like a growl that never ended. The sound followed him one night as he crossed the Luibeg burn with a lantern, checking on scattered sheep before a storm rolled in. At first he thought it was the wind. Then he thought it was something in the trees. But whatever it was, it moved when he moved. When he stopped, it stopped. And when he reached the tree line, he saw it. A figure crouched low, long-limbed, with something unnatural about its posture. Not quite on all fours, but not upright either. It moved as if it was caught between the two. He remembered it turning its head slowly towards him, and in the light of his lantern he could see its face. Not a wolf, not a man, something in between. Realizing what he was looking at, he ran. When he told this story in the village, to his surprise, nobody laughed. People had their own stories, livestock going missing, stones thrown from the tree line with no one around. A trapper who vanished one winter and was found months later with his body torn apart, not eaten, not scavenged, just broken. Some people talked about a man who'd been banished from the village years earlier, an outcast who'd lived in the woods, accused of crimes that were never proven. Others said it was a spirit, a cursed soul, someone who'd taken the form of a beast in death because he'd lived as one in life. This was a Christian Highlands after all. There was no room for vague monsters or half-beliefs. It was something unnatural. It was either the devil or the punishment of sin. The minister who recorded the shepherd's account didn't dismiss it entirely. He noted that the glen was a place of uncommon silence, and said that even the local dogs wouldn't follow their masters into the woods beyond the burn. He left it there with no conclusion and no sermon. And just a few miles north, another legend would eventually take root. Fearly Amor, the big grey man of Benmacdui. He's not described as a creature of claw or fang, but instead a towering presence said to follow hill walkers on the high ridges, his footsteps echoing behind them in the mist. Sightings stretch back into the 20th century, with respected climbers reporting an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched, or hunted, by something vast and unseen. Whatever stalked the glen may not have been the same thing, but it came from the same soil, the same atmosphere, a highland quiet so deep it starts to feel alive. By the 19th century, the story faded into local legend, but sightings didn't vanish altogether. In 1852, a gamekeeper working for the Morar estate claimed to see a tall, dark figure sprint across the moor at dusk. Too fast for a man, but too upright for any known beast. In the 1920s, a hillwalker from Aberdeen reported seeing what he called a hunched figure with a long face and a strange gait disappearing into the tree line. No tracks, no photographs, just more stories. What makes the Glen Luibeg account stands out is that it doesn't follow the pattern of imported werewolf tales. There's no transformation by moonlight, no talk of silver bullets or cursed bloodlines. There's just a cold glen, a string of sightings, and the idea that something in between lives in the hills. It's not a ghost story. It's not quite folklore. It's closer to a witness account that stuck. And in a place as remote and unchanged as the Glen, it doesn't take much to imagine the figure is still out there, waiting, just beyond the trees, just out of sight. In the late 19th century, the Highlands were changing. The railway had reached farther north, crofters were still reeling from the clearances, and traditional ways of life were being slowly eroded by industrialisation and estate consolidation. But in the remote farmland of Ross-shire, something else was stirring, something newspapers struggled to explain, and the locals refused to forget. In the summer of 1883, reports began to circulate in a local paper about a spate of livestock mutilations. Sheep were found with their throats torn out, their bodies half devoured and scattered across fields. The wounds didn't match anything familiar. Farmers knew the work of dogs, and they knew when a fox or badger had taken its share. This was different, more violent, more deliberate. Initially, the deaths were written off as the work of a rogue dog or escaped exotic animal, possibly something brought north by a travelling show. But that explanation didn't hold. Tracks were inconsistent or missing altogether. Traps caught nothing, and then came the sightings. A farmhand working near Eventon reported seeing a dark figure on two legs near the tree line at dusk. He said it had a long snout and that it moved with a kind of loping speed, upright but slightly hunched. Another man near Alness claimed to have seen a creature crouched by the river, which looked up with the face of a dog and the eyes of a man. It would have been dismissed as hearsay, except the livestock deaths kept happening. There was an article published in late August that year that offered a more dramatic description. Some say it's no creature of this world at all, but a thing that walks like a man and bears the head of a great black dog. It does not seem to fear man or beast, and no trap or shot has caught it. Farmers speak in whispers of the thing in the woods. Whether beast or devil, none dare follow it. Though the language was theatrical, the tone wasn't entirely mocking. The paper acknowledged that the mutilations were real and that panic had begun to set in among isolated farming communities. Livestock insurance claims surged. Some crofters refused to graze sheep in certain fields, especially those that bordered the denser woods. A local minister tried to calm the situation, describing it as a time of fear fueled by wild stories and the imagination of idle men. But even he admitted, under pressure from the press, that the suffering of animals cannot be denied. Then, just as quickly as it started, the attacks stopped. No animal was ever caught, no body found. Whatever had been responsible, if anything tangible at all, it left no final trace. Theories ranged widely. Most believe it was a wolf. Others believed it to be a rabid dog, or even a misidentified poacher, using the fear to his advantage. But among locals, another explanation took root. A man who'd become something else. A shape changer. a creature cursed or born wrong. Not a legend from Europe or some old folk tale, but a real figure who'd walked the fields and vanished into the forest. What makes this case so compelling isn't just the descriptions, it's the reluctant tone of the reporting. The articles don't mock or exaggerate, they reflect a genuine sense of rural fear. And unlike most Victorian werewolf tales, which were clearly fictional or allegorical, this account doesn't come from a magazine story or gothic serial. It came from rural press, from people who worked the land and found their animals torn open with no explanation. It fits with a broader pattern of 19th century monster panic, a time when unexplained animal attacks, ghost sightings, and stories of half-seen figures in the woods were common. Not because people were gullible, but because life on edge of civilization left space for belief. When something strange happened, it wasn't dismissed with science. It was whispered about. It was feared. Today the story of the Ross-shire wolfman has faded into local legend. But those fragments remain, not in museums or archives, but in the margins of old newspaper clippings and the half-remembered warnings passed down on lonely farms. Don't go into the woods alone. And if you hear something walking behind you on two legs, don't turn around. The stories of something unusual in Moray began to emerge in the early decades of the 20th century. Scattered sightings, frightening rumours, but nothing headline-worthy at first, just murmurs. In 1907, a schoolboy walking home from his aunt's farm near Kinloss claimed he saw a black animal like a dog but bigger with longer legs, sprinting across a nearby field. When asked if it might have been a deer, he said no. It ran differently. Low to the ground, he said, and then it stood up. The story was dismissed as childish exaggeration, but it wasn't the last report. 4 years later in 1911, two farmhands working near Elgin reported a similar sighting at dusk. What they first thought was a large dog emerged from the trees on all fours, but then, about halfway across the field, it stopped. Slowly it rose onto two legs and stood, like a man stretching after a long run, they said. It stood there for a few seconds before dropping down again and disappearing into the woods. One of the men later refused to work alone on the property, too afraid to go back. By the 1920s, the stories had begun to collect a name: the Black Beast of Moray. Not because anyone had seen it up close, but because that's how it was always described. Black, fast, frightening. Too big for a dog, too thin for a bear, too upright for anything locals were used to. In 1928, a local newspaper included a brief item in the Odd Notes column. Reports continue of the so-called Beast of Moray, last seen near Forres. Witnesses claim a dark creature crosses fields at great speed, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes 2. While there's little evidence, the consistency of accounts is strange enough to warrant mention. Again, no photos, no bodies, no clear explanation, but more people came forward. By the early 1930s, it was no longer just farmers. A railway worker near Rothes reported seeing something moving across the tracks during a foggy morning shift. He described it as a figure hunched and fast, with a strange gait in the sense that it was watching him. He didn't report it officially, only to a friend, who later repeated it to a folklorist collecting regional tales. Unlike other stories, the Black Beast of Moray never attacked. There were no dead livestock and no signs of violence. It wasn't a monster in the traditional sense, it was more like a presence, an apparition. Something glimpsed just long enough to frighten you. Some modern researchers have tried linking the sightings to the British big cat phenomena, suggesting the creature may have been an escaped puma or lynx. Others believe it falls closer to what's now called a cryptid, a creature that exists more in stories than in science, like the American Dogman or the Beast of Bray Road. But those are tidy terms, they fit into categories, and the Black Beast of Moray never quite did. It doesn't follow the werewolf pattern either. There's no mention of transformation, no cursed individuals or old bloodlines, no silver bullets, but when people saw it, they often used the same word, man-like. Not human, not animal, something between. So what could it have been? A misidentified predator? A story that took root and grew with each retelling? A product of isolation, darkness and imagination? Or something older? Something that's always been there in the forests, moving at the edges of sight? Truth is, we don't know. But like so many of these stories, the beast never really went away. Reports slowed after the 1940s, but never stopped completely. Even in recent decades, occasional walkers, night shift drivers or gamekeepers have mentioned seeing something strange. Always alone, always too briefly to be sure. Maybe it was never real in the way we expect, but it was real enough to be seen. And sometimes, especially in stories like this, that's enough. In the early 1950s, Loch Morar was a still, quiet, unspoiled place. Remote and sparsely populated. The sort of landscape where stories have time to settle in, and where no one looked at you strangely for believing in things best left unspoken. The woman who told this story decades later was in her 70s at the time of the interview. She hadn't wanted attention, she didn't contact newspapers, she didn't even like to talk about it, not until someone came asking. When she finally did speak, her account was simple, measured. But she was unmistakably shaken by what she remembered. It had been a still evening. She was walking along the edge of the loch, not far from her home, when she noticed something moving near the tree line. At first, she assumed it was a man, tall, broad, covered in thick hair. But the closer she looked, the more her initial assumption fell apart. The figure was about 70 feet away, moving strangely, not just walking upright, sometimes dropping to all fours, then rising again. It didn't behave like any animal she recognized, and its head wasn't human. The way she described it, it looked like a wolf's head set on a man's body. Not a mask, not distorted, a real breathing thing. What stayed with her the most wasn't the size or the movement, it was the way that it looked at her. She didn't describe it as aggressive, it didn't snarl or lunge, but it knew she was there, and when its eyes met hers, something in that moment unsettled her so deeply that she backed away without thinking. Thankfully, the creature didn't follow. It turned calmly and moved back into the woods, first on 2 legs, then dropping again to 4 as it vanished between the trees. She never saw it again. Her story didn't make the local papers. It didn't become a staple of the area's folklore. But it was recorded in cryptozoological research decades later, most notably by investigator Nick Redfern. He treated the story not as legend, but as part of a wider pattern. Sightings of wolf-like beings across the UK, described without embellishment by people who clearly believed what they'd seen. What makes this account unusual isn't just the creature, it's the location. Loch Morar already has a reputation for the unexplained. It's home to Moray, Scotland's other lake monster, and one of the few with sightings dating back well into the 19th century. Some accounts of Moray describe a plesiosaur-type shape breaking the surface of the loch. Others, older still, speak of a mermaid-like figure, a sign of death for those who see her. But clearly this was something else entirely. A creature on land, seen clearly with no ties to folklore, no warning, and no clear reason to appear. Just one moment, one woman, and the thing she never forgot. Whatever was seen that evening in the 1950s, it didn't leave tracks, nor photos, no second witness. Only the stare. It was still and dark when Neil Goodman set off. A postman by trade, he'd been driving this road for years. The route from his village into Oban was familiar. A winding stretch flanked by trees, scattered cottages, and the occasional sheep pressing up against the wire fences. But on this particular morning, in the winter of 1967, something changed. He was maybe 15 minutes from town, the road slick with frost, when something moved in the distance, fast. At first he thought it was a man. The figure was upright, tall, running down the verge in long loping strides. But there was something wrong with the way it moved, something that didn't line up. Its body was built like a man's, but leaner, with unnatural posture. And as it came closer, Goodman saw it clearly in the headlights. It wasn't a man. It had wolf-like features, a long snout, pointed ears, and something feral in the shape of the eyes. The limbs too were wrong, too long, too fluid, like it wasn't quite built for the ground it was moving on. Goodman slowed down, unsure whether to stop, unsure if he was seeing it properly. But the creature didn't turn, didn't even acknowledge the vehicle. It ran straight past, crossing just ahead of the bonnet, then continued up the road behind him at full sprint. When he looked in the mirror, nothing. No noise, no growl, just the pounding of footsteps in the frost, and then silence. He drove on to the sorting office in Oban, hands tight on the wheel. Later he described himself as shaken, but clear about what he'd seen. Not a dog, not a man, something in between. Goodman never reported the sighting to the police. It wasn't written up in any newspaper. But years later, it surfaced during research into British lycanthrope accounts. He never tried to claim it was a werewolf, he didn't speculate. He just described it exactly as he remembered. Now this wasn't the only strange thing said to have been seen in Argyll during that decade, but it was one of the few with such precision. A creature running in a straight line, showing no interest in being seen, and no concern about what might follow. One witness, one sighting, and something that shouldn't have been there. These accounts don't offer simple explanations. They're not tidy legends, and they don't follow the usual folklore patterns. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's no cursed bloodline, no transformation under a full moon, just strange violence, upright figures, and a haunting sense that something walked too close. Vampires at least come with a script. Their stories are about seduction and hunger, cold, calculated, slow. Werewolves are different. They're about heat, instinct, the suddenness of change, the moment when something inside you snaps and takes over. And maybe that's what frightens us, because these stories aren't really about creatures. They're about boundaries, the fragile ones we draw. What stays with us isn't just what we witness. It's the idea that someone could change, not into something supernatural, but into something primal. The woods are frightening because they're older than us and darker. Whatever lives there doesn't care about categories. These aren't ghost stories. They're stories about losing control, about crossing a line. And right now, in a world that feels darker, louder, and more divided with each passing day, those lines feel thinner than ever. We like to think we're above it, that we've moved past the wild, the cruel, the instinctive. But stories like these remind us, the wild was never that far away. And once that line's crossed, it's hard to go back.